This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true crime junkies and truth seekers. Nanette Bartow back with another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. We are back to finish off the letter M today in the alphabet, the lowercase m that is. I'm going to go ahead and start just with the numbers for last month on the podcast. We had 67 listenable episodes and 7,911 downloads. Looks like we're kind of roughly adding or having an additional 600 to 800 downloads a month, which is great for the show. That means that the information is getting out there and people are listening. I know that sometimes this handwriting examination can be a little bit boring to some people. And I would like to say that as soon as we get out of that, we'll get back into the more interesting stuff that people like to follow, like the communications and the letters themselves. But for now, we're going to go ahead and go back into the full presentation, and we're going to start back where we left off in the middle of the lowercase m's. There we go. And we can there we go. All right. So basically we stopped off, I want to say about midway through, we were talking about the Zodiac Killer's lowercase m's and the fact that we had these two hump ends that were being used, which basically look like almost a cursive version with no connectivity. And when we look back up at Jack's, just to kind of remind everybody, this letter M up here is a capital letter M that is actually written in a small case size in the middle of lowercase printing. So it is a capital letter form, but posed as a lowercase letter. This would be the type of letter that Jack would want to actually conceal and hide from the communications, because he obviously is attempting to disguise his handwriting. But as we go down the line, we do see that he does have the capability of making a regular style lowercase m. It does tend to have that shallow top part where the midsection does not come back down to the baseline. You can see it's just barely two little tiny humps there at the top. And then we see some with a little bit more of a midsection, but it kind of gives you an idea that he does have the capacity to do that lowercase m. He also does the three hump M, cursive M, which again is done in the middle of printing and it is not connected. We can see there that there's no connections on either ends of that M. And then he also does the two hump M, which again is a cursive construction, but it only has two instead of three humps. So that does kind of set the precedence for the fact that he looks at that two hump M as a letter M. And we are going to find that in these communications as a disguise. And if you also notice, it is one of the least ways that the least amount of times he uses. I mean, I only found these very rarely throughout his handwriting. So he predominantly uses this capital M construction as a lowercase m. And so back down into the Zodiac, we do see these M's with these very shallow midsections. Once again, very consistent with what we see Jack doing up here. And as we go across the way, we talked about the two hump M. We're going to see some more of those. The DC Freeway Phantom did actually bring that midsection all the way down. We see that lean to the right with the slightly taller right hump again that we talked about that existed in Jack's handwriting up here. The SLA, very, very hard to tell. Obviously, it was a very bad copy. So we do just have that one M that is visible. And when we get into the citizen letter, we kind of see this construction of a very angular, almost wave-like W that's occurring that we talked about in the capital letter M's back in the slide before from last week. Channel 9 News, again, we see that the lowercase m done with the very shallow top portion. Again, very consistent with what we see happening in Jack's handwriting. And that just tells us again that everything with the star has actually already been confirmed as the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. So these are all within the range and the realm or the arsenal of the writing power of this author. And what I'm looking to do is determine whether or not that stuff exists, obviously, in Jack's and in other crime sprees. So we also saw in the Channel 9 newsletter that that double hump M is done again without any connective portions to it. Red Phantom literally has just a typical style M like we see happening up here in Jack's. The OCCK case had another unusual set of letter M's. You can actually see they're waving back and forth because he's constantly trying to change his slant. And that's just not typically normal. If somebody has a slant, it usually runs kind of conformed with each letter and runs in a fashion. I have seen some variable slants where people tend to, or not tend to, they have the capability of slanting one letter backwards and the next letter forward. But typically speaking, that particular letter that slants in one direction is usually slanting the same within all those letters. And at the end of OCCK, I actually found that double hump M once again. Very interesting to note that that keeps popping itself up. We see it over here in Herb Cain again. And then, of course, in the second Herb Cain letter, we see the regular style lowercase m. In Atlanta, Georgia, we actually had the triple hump M's, and that's because it was primarily cursive in this particular communication. But I just wanted to show that consistency between those triple hump M's and Jack's. And of course, we see this angular part. We talked about that comes up into that entrance stroke. And we also see these more flattened, rounded humps, but the first hump and the third hump tend to be higher than the other. And that's what we see happening down here. I mean, if you look at this one, the first hump and the second hump both are taller than that middle hump right there. And then the final one, we saw that entrance stroke that was lifted up off the baseline, starts up in the middle of the air. It is an angular hump that is very similar to what we see happening up here in Jack's. Atlanta, Georgia Killer chose the two hump M as well. Again, very not a coincidence. I don't think so. We do see that very shallow midsection in at least one of them that is definitely consistent with what we talked about in Jack's handwriting. And when we got down into the Scorpion letter to John Walsh, again, these two hump M's show up. So we do have some that have beginning strokes or a stem on the left-hand side, but he clearly placed two in there without that beginning stroke. The John Benet Ramsey is the more interesting one to me because not only do we have these shallow midsections of the M's that we see up in Jack's, but we found literally what I call that smoking gun. In the end of the letter, I found two words. I believe it was the word common and the word immediate, where the construction of the capital M with the four strokes. So it's a little tough to see here, but I can make apart these different strokes that occur in the M, and you can see how it is constructed with four separate strokes to make that capital case M in the middle of lowercase printing. So it's not just the fact that it's a capital structure, but it meets all the criterias. It is four separate strokes. It is squatty and fat, just like the ones in Jack's writing. It is it is capital printing in the middle of lowercase writing. So it really hit on every level. When I got into Tom Voigt's writing, I found that the actual construction of those letter M's are extremely consistent with the citizen letter. So this may be another construction at a later date that Jack was using. And of course, it also depends on the register and what he's writing, I find, because obviously these M's here I would not have found in Jack's reports, but these M's here I did. So it really does depend sometimes on what somebody's writing as to what type of writing they're going to use. The finale letter to Tim Miller, nothing big to quote there. It looks like he really attempted to kind of stay very strictly to the form of the lowercase m in general. We do see where he is really breaking them apart and making them different strokes. So you know that that's a disguise, because this would be the more quicker way to actually write the letter M. But we see several of these M's where the entrance stroke or the stem stroke of the M is done separately from the first hump. And that's just kind of an unusual unusual method to do something. In the Bruce Ivans letter, we do find a lowercase m, just one of them, kind of carries that construction that we're seeing up here in the Citizen letter, but it does have that more shallow midsection and smaller humps, just like we saw up here in Jack's writing, leaning obviously to the right, like we see occurring in Jack's writing as well. Capital letter N's. Now, this one was also an interesting letter for me. Jack has these different variations of the capital letter N, and of course we see some that look almost perfect, where each of the strokes of the letter N is done evenly, so it makes it look nice and square. We have some where it's actually leaning forward, but one of the bigger signs in Jack's handwriting is this free-flowing exit stroke of the ending of the N, where it rises up into the air taller than the rest of the N. And as you go through here, you can start to see this. I have arrows pointing to those exit strokes where it just rises up into the air. Now, he also has this curvature that occurs in the midsection coming off of the first initial stem stroke of the N as he breaks down or goes down into the middle of this letter. We can see that curvature there. And I placed these slant bars. You guys are going to start seeing these slant bars now. I hesitated doing it at first because I thought it might cover up too many of the letters, but I tried to do them thin enough that they didn't actually take away from the letter form that we're looking at. So as you go through here, I took and I laid this crossbar down, and then I laid it down on additional ends as I went through the presentation. So basically what I'm trying to show is that slant that Jack carries, and whether or not that slant actually exists in the communications of other writings. So just to start with, well, and then let's go over here. This is what I call the W form of the letter N. And we can see that it's got this entrance stroke that starts here on the left-hand side. And then it works up to what would be, this should have been the first stroke of the letter N, and then coming down into the midsection, and then rising once again up off into the air with that extended stroke or exit stroke. So when he does this in haste, this first initial stroke actually is quite open, making this letter look like a W. So we're going to be looking for the signs of that in the Zodiac's handwriting. Now, in the Lipstick Killer's writing, I was able to find several things that occur. The way that this curvature happens in this midsection and connects to the exit stroke or the final stem of the N actually creates this very pointed, very thin midsection where it looks like the two are merging together instead of being open like we see over here in this very first N, where this space is nice and open because these particular strokes are written independent of each other and do not clash and run into one another. So I did start to see that in many of these communications. So I began putting those arrows down so that you will see that when it occurs as well. We do have the similar slant as we see in Jack's handwriting. So we do know that that is within the realm of this particular author. Again, I think we saw 3 times here where that actually ran in, 4 times here where these two strokes collided with each other and made that section that should have been open and clear, it actually collides and runs the two together. So it appears as though the cross stroke or the mid stroke of the N actually runs directly into the midway of the final stroke of the N. Now, the Kern letter is not only has that first initial stroke that we talked about up here in Jack's handwriting, so it moves down and then it comes out. We see that curvature that is happening inside of the mid stroke, which we talked about up here. It's fairly heavy in Jack's writing. As you go down, you can just look and find many of these that have that curvature in that middle section. Now, of course, we see a lot of 3-stroke ends where he is attempting to piece them together like a puzzle. And again, that is not natural. It is quite easier and faster, more efficient to do that in a single stroke. But we do see that Jack does that in his letter M's by nature, even in his own natural handwriting. So maybe he just likes to take the time to do that. Elizabeth Short had some definite consistency with the kern letter. We see again that curvature, that hump that happens in the first portion of the letter N. That is definitely consistent with what we see happening up here, you guys, in Jack's writing. We see that hump in that capital N construction when this really should be more pointed. That is very consistent. We do see that the slant, again, is very similar, and we are definitely finding not only the letter N that is consistent with Jack's letter Ns, but we are also finding other letter Ns that are consistent. So here is the one in Elizabeth Short, very consistent with the one in Dear Dash, in the Dear Draft Board letter. I believe I saw it one other place in here, this mucked up version of the letter N, and I'm sure as we come across it, we can talk about that then. In the Sorry Mary, when we look at this more streamlined version of the letter N, nice and wide and open, the 3 separate strokes, you can see right down into that midsection is quite open, is very consistent with the disguise capital letter N, in which case he's trying to make it look very copybook, very perfect almost, if you will, but we do start to see that they are starting to slant to the right. They're not near as upright as we would expect in copybook. And the Dear Draft Board, again, we just had a home run hit with the way this particular portion of the letter N at that first section of the stem and the midsection actually creates almost this there's a slight curvature to it as it moves up to the top. And we can see that that is definitely occurring in Jack's handwriting as well. I believe I notated that one. Let's see, with the high rising, right exit stroke and the very thin pointed bottom portion of the midsection, which is very consistent with Jack's handwriting as we see up here. I want to say that here we go. Here's that one that is slightly curved on both sides of the midsection and the entrance stroke that creates kind of more of a mountain shape rather than that strict V shape that we're seeing. And as we go down the line in the Zodiac stuff, we start to see more of that perfect construction of the letter N that is consistent with the Sorry Mary letter. And on down the line, we start to see once again this more haphazardly letter N, which has the entrance stroke again. And that entrance stroke is identified by the fact that this stroke right here is twice the thickness of the rest of the stroke. So that indicates that that pen passed twice there, started up here above the baseline, worked its way down, and then back up before it started into the midsection of the letter N. But when you take a look at this particular letter N, you're going to find this style throughout the rest of the communications. And it is very consistent with what we see happening in Jack's handwriting, such as these ends up here, very consistent. The Fairfield letter is where I started to see, again, this is very similar. This kind of, it gives me that thought if I turned it on its side, it was a number 2, or that squiggly midsection where it's rounded as it leaves out of the first stem stroke and works its way down through the center and into the next exit stroke. That is consistent with what we were seeing back here in the Zodiac Killer, Dear Draft Board and the Elizabeth Short. So again, not surprised to see that work itself out in the Fairfield letter because, as I'd said, there are other letters from the Dear Draft Board and from Elizabeth Short that are consistent with other letter Ns within the Zodiac's realm. And Fairfield, again, is Zodiac writing. The DC Freeway Phantom, that letter N is very consistent with what we saw in DB Cooper, and those were extremely close in time frame. I mean, so close, we're talking November 15th and November 24th. So I don't find that so much as a coincidence, especially when the communications are so close in a time frame and the disguise seems to be nearly identical as to what is being done. Going on through, we do see the copybook ends once again. We also see these ones that we talked about up here in Lipstick Killer, which is where that center stroke actually protrudes right into the midway point of the exit stem of the N, again creating that very thin retraced or redrawn section down there in the middle of the letter N, making it extremely pointy. Again, we see that right up there in Lipstick. So And we also see it in Jack's. It's not as if this is not something we don't see in Jack's. In this particular letter N right here, once again, we see how that midsection of that first hump actually moves down, and it connects right at about halfway, a little less than halfway of the exit stem of the N. And again, it's retraced and redrawn within that section. So it is something that is occurring in Jack's handwriting. So not necessarily so much of a disguise as he just doesn't realize that that's a characteristic he has. We do see that in D.B. Cooper, this long drawn out first stem of the letter N. This is very consistent with the Riverside Phantom, or with the, with the Red Phantom, which is the Dear Marco letter. And then we get back into some of these other N's. Again, here's that same shape of the letter N that we saw back here in the beginning of D.B. Cooper, also in the DC Freeway Phantom. Let's see here. Continue on with D.B. Cooper. Again, we have additional letter N's that are consistent with rest of the N's surrounding these cases. The Albany News letter N's, if they weren't perfect copybook or an attempt at perfect copybook, we actually see they are quite consistent with the Channel 9 News letter N's. So that tells me that, again, very close in time frame as far as when these communications were written. It's almost as if as he moves from one disguise in a communication, that he continues to use that in surrounding communications at the same time. And moving on down the line into OCCK, we do see that those letter N's, again, are extremely consistent with backup in D.B. Cooper. I mean, I've got this one marked down here because it is nearly identical to what we see is happening in the Scorpion letters. And of course, as well in the, as we continue through the OCCK and we come down to some of these, we start to see that they're also very consistent with Scorpion and the Atlanta, Georgia Killer. No surprise here, we are back to the Ohio letter, or the Vowinovich letter in 2001, and we saw a couple things happening here. Number one, we saw that curved midsection that came down into the exit stroke, which causes a retrace or a redraw in one of the ends. We have the what I referred to as that squiggly N, which is where it's curved both at the top of the first hump and at the bottom as it exits into the second hump, which was consistent with Fairfield, Elizabeth Short, and who else do we have that with? Dear Draft Board. And as we move down, we see the letter N that I think he probably would have wanted to keep in disguise, but we see that it is accidentally dropped here. And that is that first stroke that starts up above the baseline. It works its way down, comes up into the first hump of the N, down through the midsection. And then, of course, that rightward exit that seems to reach out into the sky taller than the rest of the letter. Now, that movement that keeps occurring is very consistent with this letter N up here. Of course, it has some of the other variables like the rounded top section here. It does have the exit stroke that actually waves off and to the right. Looks like it's trying to separate itself from the rest of the letter, but still consistent. We also had the letter N style here that we found in the let's see here. We found it in the D.B. Cooper writing. We found it in the DC Freeway Phantom writing. We found it in several of them, actually. It's probably a more common structure, but the fact that we can find all these different style N's in one communication is likely that it is the same author. When I got into Anthrax, I found the same consistency with the way the N actually ran right into the midsection of the right-hand stem or exit stroke of the N, creating that very thin and retraced area at the bottom of the N. We can see that it's actually being made in separate strokes, as we talked about up here in Jack's handwriting. In this particular N right here, we've got 3 separate strokes that actually, you can visibly see the break at the top here. You can see that this extracurricular portion is the fact that he did not use one single stroke. This is 3 separate strokes. And that's what we saw happening down here in the Anthrax, along with some of your more perfect copybook. But again, look at this letter N here. We have that midsection that comes and hits right at the halfway point of the exit stem. And when that occurs, it causes a retrace right here in this section, making that nice thin area we talked about in many of the other communications up here. We see them here, we see it here, and then we see it throughout other communications. When I got into Tom Voigt's handwriting, of course, we can see that several of these have now been annotated to be consistent with other letter ends in these communications, which I do believe is not a coincidence, since in the letter to Tom Voight, this individual is attempting to take credit for the Zodiac killings. The letters in Tim Miller, the ends, again, we see that redraw, retrace with the curvature of the center portion, and we see where that comes out and makes that very tiny thin point on the bottom end of the N. And then we start to see the other ends that had that wave off that we talked about over here in the Ohio letter, where it kind of separates itself and it's much wider from the first hump to the exit stroke than it is from the first stem to the midsection of the letter N. And of course, we also see these more attempt at more copybook, more uniform, but we still keep seeing that point at which the center section is connecting to the stem and being retraced at that bottom portion. The lowercase n's, this is another n that I think Jack would have wanted to conceal or to hide, though I was able to find several instances of that particular letter n, and that's the lowercase. It's a capital construction n found in the middle of lowercase printing, which when the first initial stroke or the entrance stroke of that letter is separated far enough from the initial stroke or the first stem of what a capital N would have, it makes it look like a W. So I like to kind of identify with some type of form or fashion in people's writing that would allow me to make a reference to what that appearance is. And as we go down the line, we can see that this one that does not have all of the curvatures in it actually looks exactly like a W. If I set that aside by itself, you would think it was a W, not a letter N. But it is, in fact, a capital letter N constructed as the size of a lowercase letter in the middle of lowercase printing. So we do see that he also has the capability of making normal ends. So I've notated those and I've talked about those throughout. And I've also shown his version of the double hump N, which is interesting because not only does he use the double hump for the letter M, but he also uses it for the letter N. And we're going to see that throughout the communications. So let's get started here. We can see in the Lipstick Killer's case that double hump M is is one of the very first times that we see that writing in the middle. It's a cursive form in the middle of printed writing. We see as we go through the different strokes, what I was talking about before about this attempt. I want to say that it was in the lowercase m's. I also talked about it in the h's, which was this stem stroke that is separated and higher than the rest of the letter. We're going to see that completely throughout in all of these. So it's almost as if this was either a telltale sign or a reminder of something, or this is the way he perceived that this disguise should go. But as you go through, you can see all of these ends here with this very high entrance stroke. You can see it continue on in the Kern werewolf. So starts in Elizabeth Short, ends up in the Kern letters. We can start to see also that many of these letters actually coincide or cross-reference to other letters. So something like the Dear Draft Board letter, this one here is very consistent with what we're seeing in the werewolf letters. We also see that entrance stroke that is taller than the rest of the letter. And then I did notate this in the letter H's, the lowercase h's, where the actual hump of the H and the hump of this N, is not only flattened in the appearance, but has a very wide base between the two, the entrance stroke and the exit stroke of the N, which we did see in the letter H. So we'll talk about those as we go through too. Now in Oswald, when I got there, I saw that W effect, which is very consistent with what we were seeing happen in the Zodiac Killer case. So here are some of these lowercase n's where I talk about that entrance stroke that is separate from the rest of the N, making it almost look like it's a W rather than an N, but this is in fact a letter N. And there were several of them that I found. So it was very consistent with what we were seeing. And when I got over here, I found not only did we have that W appearance, but we had one of the ends actually had the curvature on it. And that particular letter N right there is extremely consistent with these letter N's that we're finding in Jack's handwriting. I mean, that just knocks me off my feet and blows me away. We have the entrance stroke that is separate from the initial stroke or the first stem stroke of the letter N, and we have the curvature of the exit stroke, which then again makes it look quite like a W, as we're seeing up here in Jack's writing. Again, we see the wide base of the separation of the 2 feet of the N, and of course we do see that high stroke over the entrance stroke, the stem stroke of the letter N that is sticking up above the rest of the letter, very consistent with these other ones that we've seen. Now, the DC Freeway Phantom is one that is quite different from the rest of the letter N's that we've seen in here, which is a taller, thinner version, still leaning to the right as we would expect as far as slant is concerned, but it is one of them that has a visible difference between the disguise of the rest of the writings that we're looking at. Going on through, we can see that the DB Cooper letter N's are very consistent with the Albany, New York letter N's as far as shape. And we do see kind of that squareness of the top and the wider portion at the bottom, which we were seeing up here in the Dear Draft Board as well. I've kind of mixed it up. So basically, if you just sit here and go through some of these, you'll find that many of these ones that are listed in red can be found in direct relation to other communications as we go through, such as Atlanta, Georgia, with that very flattened out hump with the very wide base. We see that happening over here in the Herb Cain letter. We see it happening again in the Red Phantom letter. I need to change that. It's not Riverside. I don't know why I've associated it to that, but again, that is a disguise that is actually running in tandem with many of these letters. When I got into, again, Tom Voigt's letter, we see that the construction of that letter N is extremely consistent with the Citizen letter from the Zodiac Killer. So again, no coincidence that this person is attempting to take credit for the Zodiac case when there is actually letters that are formed exactly like what we're seeing over here in Tom Voigt's letter, including the little exit stroke, this little foot that comes off the bottom of the N. We can see that happening over here in the Citizen letter as well. Let's see, Bruce Ivans, we had similar consistency with the shapes, the shape of the hump, the flow or the slant of the actual letter N, and then not a lot really to say in the Tim Miller letter. We can see that these look like they are pretty much an attempt at making some type of a perfect form, though I could say that some of these letter N's are absolutely the same shape in the top of the hump. They do not lean right. They are very perfectly straight up and down. Had they had a little slant to them, they would have been very similar to some of Jack's letter N's. The letter O's, not usually a lot to say here other than where does that O stop and start? Is there any type of flattening on one side versus the other? Are they left open? Are they completely closed? What shape are they? So this is basically some of the things that I came up with in Jack's stuff, is that Jack not only sometimes writes a cursive version, letter O, we can see that loop on the inside of it that actually makes it look like it's cursive. And this happened in a lot of Jack's writing. So I'm sure that this is one of those things that he would have tried to have concealed and kept out of the writing. But we're going to actually see in the lowercase o where he was not capable of doing that, especially in the Zodiac's writing. He has this flattened portion on the bottom of the O, which I have marked by this particular slant bar and copy and pasted that slant bar in several other locations to show you that that flat side was consistent with Jack's writing and how that actually pertains to these other communications. Now, in many cases, we can see easily the marked area where Jack started and stopped his letter O, and it is approximately the 11 to midnight hour on the letter O. I'm pointing to it here with these red arrows. And as we go through, we can start to see that there are consistencies. So we the lipstick killers is a little muddied up, so we can't really tell where it stops and starts, but we can see the general shapes. And one of the shapes that I notate for Jack is kind of this egg shape. I also found these ones that look like teardrops. So we see this teardrop thing here that's going on in the lipstick killer, and I found that in several locations of other communications. In fact, it even happened in short here with the teardrop. We had what I call this two-stroke letter O, and we also had the starting and stopping point of the letter O in Elizabeth Short that was consistent with Jack. So going on through, let's see here. This is more of the odd shaped letter O, which is kind of this chunky or fat, wider O that we see that is an attempt to be used throughout some of the communications. But then we also see where the openings again are at the very top. And it's not closed up. So we're seeing these letters that are not completely closed. But then when they are closed, we see that it completely overlaps in Jack's. So we're looking for those items. Oh, I did actually, I think I put all of the O's together, capital and lowercase. So we're looking at some capital letters. That's probably why we have these bigger, chunkier, fatter ones. But as we go through, like just as you enter into Sherry Jo Bates, you start to see this fat teardrop effect again. In the Dear Draft Board letter, fat teardrop. We can see that in the Zodiac Killer, here is that two-stroke, very thin and angular points at the top and bottom of the O that is consistent with Elizabeth Short. And then we also see that cursive letter O that I was talking about in the Zodiac's handwriting. Now, these ones were, again, these were home run hits for me because they are absolutely identical. They are the same shape. They are laying on their sides to the right. They have that hook or that extra loop coming through the center of it as if it's a cursive letter O in the middle of printed writing. This is one of the very first characteristics of the 20 that I found in the Zodiac's handwriting as compared to Jack that got me interested in this case, because this is a very unusual construction to use a cursive type O in the middle of printed writing. And when I found that in the Zodiac's handwriting and realized that Jack also did that in his own writing, I was absolutely blown away. And it gave me that, or it piqued my interest, should I say, to the point that I needed to look at this handwriting. There might be something to Jack Tarrance. Going through into the Fairfield letters, again, we're finding these more fat, chunky O's, something quite different from what we know that Jack normally does. But as we move through some of the Zodiac stuff, we start to see once again this teardrop shape that occurred in the Red Phantom letter, which consistent with the Dear Draft Board, consistent with the Elizabeth Short, consistent with Sherry Jo Bates. Let's see, it's kind of here, although this one is kind of sideways. We do see that that is more of a teardrop shape that has a very angular, pointed, triangular top on that particular O. Going down into DC Freeway Phantom, we started to see again these two-stroke O's that made it very thin, angular on the top, angular on the bottom, and that is consistent with the Zodiac Killer. That is consistent with Elizabeth Short. Let me see where else I found that. I started marking these two-stroke O's, and we see it in the Oakland County child murders where it's actually used two separate strokes to make it, which we also see the teardrop formation in the Oakland County child murders. You guys, this is not a coincidence to see these two-stroke O's, because most people do not make an O with two separate strokes, is really kind of, again, another one of those home run hits. I did mark also in purple. So if you look for the purple shapes, you're going to find there are similar and consistent shapes in those disguised O's. In the Albany, we not only found these funky odd shaped O's that were found in Atlanta, Georgia, but we also once again found not only the two-stroke O is seen here, but we also found the teardrop O. SLA had at least one teardrop O. Citizen Letter actually had something extremely consistent to what we were looking at in previous ones, like up here in Elizabeth Short, which is really this very odd shaped letter O that is not closed at the top, with the opening, and the way that opening occurs is fairly similar, with the exit stroke being slightly higher and not coming back down and reaching the entrance stroke. So similarities there. Similarities with the opening being at the same position as Jack's, and of course that slant with that flattened side is consistent in the Citizen Letter, as well as the rest of the Zodiac's writing. I did start to notice too that up here in the Sherry Joe Bates one, we see this O with a dot in the center. This was a symbol that was used in the ciphers of the Zodiac Killer's writing. And then, of course, I started to find it in the actual writing of other communications. So was it not only found in the ciphers of the Zodiac, it's found in the written communications of Sherry Joe Bates, of the Fairfield letters by the Zodiac Killer. We can see right here again, circle with a dot in the center. Let's see where else we found it. We found it in the Scorpion. This was actually in one of the ciphers. We found it in OCCK. We had the 2-stroke O, but we still had it with a dot in the center. Evidently, I must have failed to mark that because that was a very important one. We found it in the Channel 9 newsletter twice. Circle with the dot in the center. So this must be some type of identifying characteristic for him. Maybe this is how they identified that it was him. However, we all know that an O doesn't have a dot in the center. So that makes it extremely non-coincidental that we're finding it in so many communications that are purportedly not related to the same person. So we counted it off right there, I think, in at least 4 different. Oh, we have it in the Dear Draft Board too. Here's the circle with the dot in the center. It just keeps going on. Channel 9 News, Scorpion. See if we found any down here. Not necessarily, but we did find consistency with this oval upright shape in Tom Voigt, which was consistent with this oval upright shape of Albany, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia. Just a very similar form. And as we continue through with the teardrops, we see it in the Sacramento letter. We see it in the Tom Voigt letter. Once again, there's that teardrop. There's that sideways O that has the flattened bottom side. So we see it in the Bruce Ivans. Again, that egg shape that's laid over onto its side. We see more of those in the Tim Miller letter. Not only the teardrop effect, the starting and stopping points are consistent, the 2 strokes of the O's that occurs, and of course that more egg shape and upright version. It's just, it's all sharing. It's all really showing us. The John Benet Ramsey also had the teardrop shapes that we've been looking at, that we just talked about in all these other ones. So the teardrops seem to be a disguise being used by most of these, or being used in most of these communications. The letter P happens to be one of Terry's favorites. Terry B, who has been on the show, he has talked heavily in regards to how these letter P's appear, what they represent, what he thinks the author is attempting to portray with them. I'm just going to break down the basics of it, which sorry, we see that the overhang of the top of the P actually comes considerably back towards the left with a slight curvature on it. We see that the stem mark is actually not touching the top of the bowl of the P. We see that the bottom portion of the bowl of the P is actually surpassing the stem to the left right here. We see that little crisscross that happens. And we see that nice big gap where the P does not close in many of Jack's P's. We also see the slant of the bowl by this marked slant right here, and we're going to go through and find those as they occur. I've also marked the back side of the P to show the slant in the actual stem. And you can see how many letter P's that I have up here that are actually consistent with the letter P's that are found throughout the communications. So as we go through, we talk about, again, I just discussed in the lipstick killing case, we can see where the exit stroke of the P actually makes that slight small crisscross. Of course, the stem is a little bit higher, but we can also see how the entrance stroke actually protrudes to the left, is not connected to the actual stem, and actually moves back down from the letter P. One of the things that you note here is the actual shape or slant of that bowl. It is not perfectly round, and as expected, where we would expect a straight slant to come across the bottom of the bowl, it actually has a nice incline in that P, which is definitely consistent with what we were seeing in Jack's writing. In Elizabeth Short, we also saw that particular formation where the entrance and exit stroke of the bowl of the P surpasses the stem of the P to the left pretty generously, and we see that slant again in that P is working its way upward. So again, very consistent with what we were looking at. We do have these more perfect style P's, which we do see is definitely in Jack's arsenal. So aside from doing these ones that have these extra curricular strokes or extra elongated strokes or even flattened out, we see that he actually does make a more perfect P. And that one was actually comparable to many of those P's. It has a very short stem, which is what we see in the Sorry Mary and the Elizabeth Short. So I think to some degree, he either attempted to make it look very, very long or very, very short. But either way, that's actually what he has in his arsenal. And we can see right here next to one another in Jack's P's, one has a very short stem in comparison to the bowl, and one has a very long stem, like we saw in the Red Phantom. So another one of the P's that I picked up on was this double stroke stem that comes down into a point down here. This is something that I found in Jack's writing as well. We see it happening in a couple different places where that stem is wide open, but the bottom portion of it as it comes together is in a point. Looking at the letter P's in Sorry Mary, not only were they consistent with Jack's, but they are consistent with other letter P's within other communications. Oh my goodness, we got 5 minutes, folks. All right, so our slants are consistent because I only copied and pasted these. I did not apply these separate. I just copy and pasted from Jack's slant down onto other slants throughout the communication. And we can see that those slants are consistent. It looks like here, where did I find this big bubbly letter that was consistent with another P? We'll come across it as we go. In Sherry Jo Bates, we do find a consistency in the shape of the bowls that are consistent with other communications. Oh, I'm sorry. Here in Dear Draft Board, we have these blown up balloon type characters, which was consistent with what we've seen in the attempt of the Sherry Jo Bates writing. We also saw again that double stroke stem with the pointed bottom, which was consistent with what we were seeing back here in Jack's writing and in Elizabeth Short. We find that in the Dear Draft Board letters, so that actually connects those. Moving through the Zodiac Killer, we see different variations, but one of them I pointed out was this very angular bowl of the P that we see definitely occurring in Jack's writing, where it looks almost like a sideways triangle off the stem. Let's see, there's one that's angular. I thought I had one. There's one that's very angular right there. So again, consistencies, we see the lean, we see all this, we also see this curvature that happens in the stem right here in this letter P where it matches up to the top portion of the bowl of the P, which I thought was interesting because when I went back to look through Jack's, we can see it happening right here in this one. There's that curvature. Of course, that one did not touch back, but it happened right here in this one. There is a curvature as that stem comes up. It curves back to the left as it touches to that entrance stroke of the bowl of the P. That continued to happen. So also as I'm going through additional letter P's in the Zodiac's handwriting, we started to find more of these angular P's with the entrance stroke that is actually starting before the actual stem. And again, we had that slant that was consistent. Let's see. I started to find, here's some more of those P's that are consistent with Jack's with that curvature that occurs right there in the stem. Again, more of the angular ones that are consistent within other communications. So here we go, Channel 9 News. And throughout the Zodiac stuff, I kept finding these angular ones, but I believe they're also found, let's see here. Oh. Maybe that was back and forth in one of the confirmations with, oh, here we go, Channel 9 newsletter. There's more of them. The slant, again, is consistent within the communications, within the disguise. The citizen letter, again, has the two-stroke constructed letter P, which we do see, like I said, does occur once in a while in these other communications. So it is definitely within that arsenal, but we do see like I said, more of these angular P's that are consistent with Jack's. In the Oakland County child murder case, obviously, we have the slants that are random back and forth because he's attempting to disguise his handwriting. But I found one letter P that actually had the entrance stroke that starts all the way back to the left. It is not connected to the stem stroke itself, and we see the crisscross effect that occurs right here as the exit stroke of that bowl passes through to the left on the stem. Again, that is extremely consistent with what we see in Jack's handwriting. Herb cane, not a whole lot to notate here other than the fact that the form and the shape is consistent with many of the other P's in these communications. Oh, we are down to 1 minute. Let's see if I can finish this off real quick. I wanted to talk. Will we see it happening? Here we go again. We have that same construction in the letter P in Tom Voigt's writing. Not only do we have the similar construction of the overhang in the stem that doesn't touch and the slight crisscross at the end of the bowl, we also have the double stem stroke with the pointed bottom portion, as we notated from Jack in a couple of the other cases. Slants, again, are consistent. And I think there was basically one other style of a P, which this one happened in the D.B. Cooper case, where it looks like a single stroke where it begins and comes down, and there's quite a curvature to that. But I started to see those happening as well throughout the communication. And let's see if I can find some of those. Oh, right here. So in Atlanta, Georgia, we see it where it's actually starts right at the very bottom of the bowl, and in a single stroke works its way up and down and around. And that consistency was another disguise that was used throughout. So I did mark those. You can go through and find those as well. Let's see here. We do have the slants that are consistent in the Bruce Irons. We also have that very thin angular bowl that we are seeing that is occurring up here in the Citizen letter. So again, just another cross reference to something that's in the arsenal. That was Atlanta, Georgia. Where else did I see that one? More slants that are consistent. More shapes that are consistent. I mean, as you go back and forth, you can see that the shapes in the Scorpion P's is very similar to the shape of the bowl in the Citizen P's. So they just really all kind of just crisscross back and forth, and those shapes are there. Oh, here's another one of those P's where it is just a single stroke and wraps itself around. This is in John Benet Ramsey. This is exactly what we're looking, even in the shape and the form of that letter P and how that occurs. So we also see the angular one where the bowl of the P is actually pointing up into the air on John Benet Ramsey. And then a lot of them we see that are just kind of squigglies, just attempting to manipulate that form to disguise it. Nothing big to talk about in Anthrax. Again, it's very hard to see because of the pixelation, the stopping and starting points, but we do see that shorter stem that we talked about in the Grimes. We saw the shorter stem as well. It looks like we are done. Sorry, you guys. Have a great weekend, and I will be back with the letter O. I'm sorry. Q next week.